Chapter 1. The Shock Brigade. February 1930, in Filivka, a village near Kharkiv, Soviet Ukraine. Tato and I had just entered the village after inspecting our wheat field. There we stood, father and son, in front of St. Sophia Church in silence, and watched as hundreds of uniformed young people, armed with leaflets, marched past us. A lot of them looked to be in their early 20s, and they wore the distinctive uniform of the Komsomol, the Young Communist League, beneath their unbuttoned winter coats. Brownish-gray short pants gathered at the knee, and a military tunic topped off with a red-neck scarf and a belt across the chest. Their tall black boots made an intimidating thump as their feet hit our muddy road in unison. There were also young pioneers, with their red ties visible above their coats. Young pioneers could be as young as 9 and as old as 15, but most in this group looked to be about my age, 12. I was a pioneer on paper because you got into trouble if you didn't join. But around here, people called the red tie the devil's noose. There were also some adult marchers in city clothes, as well as others in the uniforms of youth leaders. It took a while for them all to pass by. We waited another minute or so. Then Tato and I stepped onto the road and followed them. The Saturday market was in progress in the square, and as the strangers marched past them, our friends and neighbors stopped mid-haggle and gawked at the parade, just like we had done. The marchers continued north up the street, and we continued to follow. Tato and I didn't have much choice, because our house was as far north as you could go and still be within the village. Once the parade got past the village square, the marchers dispersed. I noticed a couple of them approaching Pani Pich's cottage, while 3 stood at Comrade Olenyuk's door. By the time we got to our own house, the parade had dissolved. I pushed open our door, grateful to be away from all the drama. "Son, husband," said Mama, her face frozen in an artificial grin. She was seated at the table with my 9-year-old brother, Slavko, and 11-year-old sister, Yulia. My chair and Tato's were occupied by 2 strangers. "We have company, all the way from Canada." A young pioneer girl, wearing her red devil's noose around her neck, sat at my spot beside Yulia, as if it were hers. She had been scribbling something on a form when we walked in. The other visitor was a man sitting beside Slavko, in Tato's spot. He wore the kind of collared shirt with buttons that Roman, the priest's son, sometimes wore when he got a package from relatives in America. The sight of them occupying not just our house, but our places at the table, sent a wave of fury through me. It was bad enough that Stalin had become the dictator of all the republics in the Soviet Union, but now he was starting up his 5-year plan. It was supposed to modernize the Soviet Union, but actually hurt people like us. He was taking away our farms and making them into one big collective farm, the Khohots. He had already sent in city people, ignorant of farming, to force the change on us. But now he was sending in foreigners. They couldn't possibly know the challenges we had. Every single day since Stalin's push had begun last year, friends and neighbors had been bullied and forced into giving up their property and joining the Khohots. But why Canadians? "Slavko, go to Auntie and Uncle's barn and feed the animals," said Mama. I was extremely jealous as my brother excused himself and ran out the door. "Sit," said Mama, giving Tato and me each a look that said, "Don't argue." I had a barn to repair and chores to do, not to mention homework, but I was supposed to sit and be nice to these Canadians as they told me how to live. I pasted a smile onto my face. I'd be polite until we could get them to leave. The man smiled. "Comrade Chorny, Comrade Neil." He spoke perfect Ukrainian, but with an odd accent. "I'm Comrade White. I go by George White, although my Ukrainian name was Yuri Bialik. Let me introduce you to my daughter. The girl looked up and smiled. I'm Comrade Alice. Tato sat in Slavko's spot. I pulled up an extra chair and sat down across from Alice and Yulia. You came all the way from Canada to assist with Stalin's 5-year plan? I asked. We did, said Alice. A new tractor factory is being built in Kharkiv, and once it's finished, my father will work there. In the meantime, we're helping with the drive to get people signed up for the kolkhotzes. Her Ukrainian was almost as smooth as her father's, but the accent was more pronounced. With her light brown hair and hazel eyes, she could have been a local, but the blouse and skirt had that fine weave and careful stitching that you only saw in clothing that came in packages from North America. It made no sense that they had come here. Living in America was the ultimate dream, yet they left it to come back here to help Stalin? What's that written on your pin? Asked Yulia, staring at the ornament on the Canadian girl's lapel. Alice unclipped her pin and handed it to Yulia. It's in English script, but the words are the same as on the Young Pioneer pins here. It says, always ready. I have one too, Yulia said. She scrambled from her seat and came back with her pin in her hand and her red tie draped loosely around her neck. She set her pin on the table so we could see the Russian beside the English. They had the identical image, Lenin with a Soviet star and flame in the background. I smiled and pretended to be interested in the whole show. I had the pin as well, but I never wore it or my devil's news. Was there a communist revolution in Canada? I asked. Comrade White cleared his throat. Mama gave me a look. Yulia gazed longingly at the Lenin pin from Canada. Do you know what we should do? Alice asked Yulia. What? Asked Yulia. Alice slid her pin in front of Yulia's spot at the table. Let's trade pins. Yulia's eyes went wide. Oh my, she said. Do you mean it? I do, said Alice. Here. I watched as Alice expertly tied the devil's noose around my sister's neck, then fastened the pin to the left side of her blouse. Yulia looked like she was about to burst with pride, and I had a sick feeling in the pit of my stomach. My sister seemed far too impressed with this girl from Canada. Don't you look smart, said Alice as she straightened my sister's tie. Now promise me you'll take good care of your new pen. Of course I will, said Yulia. And I hope you'll enjoy wearing your Russian one. I will, said Alice. While this whole exchange was going on, I looked across the table at the paper Alice had been filling out. Even reading it upside down, I could see that it was a checklist of household items written in Russian. The sections listing our pots and pans and dishes and clothing were already filled out. She'd made a special note of our hand mill for grinding hard grain and our loaf pans too. This was alarming. Tato had sat down beside me in Slavko's chair. Mama served mugs of mint tea, even though it was time for lunch and my stomach was grumbling. I think she was hoping the visitors would leave. 2 extra mouths would use up a lot of our food. Unfortunately, both father and daughter looked settled in and comfortable. Comrade White launched into a speech to Tato about the advantages of living on the kolkhots while the rest of us stayed politely silent. As her father talked, the Canadian girl looked around at the icons on our walls and frowned. Her attitude was typical of all the pushy shock workers. Those Russians sent from Moscow, like Comrades Tupolev and Chort, and the locals who had bought into their lies, like Fedor's father, Comrade Berkovich, my old teacher, Comrade Holodnaya, and that stupid Comrade Smerch. Alice also glanced at the glass bowl of decades-old pisenka, colorful hand-decorated eggs, that graced our table, and at Mama's delicate embroideries covering the windows. But she seemed to be blind to their beauty. She just counted each item on her fingers, then noted the quantity on her form. She kept on glancing over to the corner of the room where Mama prayed. It was simple, but functional. Just a small table covered with a white embroidered cloth. There were beeswax candles on either side of an intricately carved crucifix. Alice leaned over the table and said, "That's going to get your family into a lot of trouble." She pointed at the prayer corner. "You really should get rid of it." "My great-grandfather carved that crucifix," I told her. "It means a lot to Mama." "Then hide it," said Alice. "We made atheists' corners at school last week," said Yulia. "You should replace it. I'm serious," Alice said. Mama held her finger to her lips. Alice sighed and continued with her inventory. Comrade White sounded like Tupolev, the head shock worker, in his arguments about why we should join the Kolkots. "You'll get tractors and modern equipment for farming. We'll work together, and everyone's quality of life will be better. We'll grow more grain than ever before." "Have you ever been a farmer?" asked Tato. "No, I'm a tractor machinist," said Comrade White. "That's impressive," said Tato. "I would never dream to advise you on making tractors. So why are you advising me on the best way to farm?" "There's no reason to be rude," said Comrade White. "Don't you understand that I'm trying to help you?" "Don't you understand what the revolution was all about?" asked Tato. "We got rid of the landlords and became our own bosses. Now Stalin wants to give us new landlords and take away our land." "You realize that your words are treason, don't you?" said Comrade White. "The only farmers who insist on owning land are the kulaks, and they're the enemies of the revolution." I felt like I had a stone in my stomach. Being labeled the kulak was serious. The term used to simply mean a rich farmer, but now it was applied to any farmer that the Stalinists wanted to eliminate. If Comrade White denounced Tato as a kulak, we could be executed or sent to a slave labor camp in Siberia. Tato took a deep breath, then slowly let it out. I could see it in his face that he regretted his outburst. He didn't respond right away, but then finally said, "I'm sorry. I spoke out of turn." The uncomfortable silence was broken when Alice set down her pencil and said, "Who would like to help with the inventory of the outside?" "I would," said Yulia, a bit too eagerly. Mama's eyes landed on me. "Neil," she said, "you can help Alice with the inventory." "But I want to," said Yulia, her eyes filling with tears. "You, young lady, need to feed the chickens and do your homework," said Mama. I knew what Mama was doing. The chickens would be happy with their early meal, but Mama wanted to keep Yulia away from Alice. Yulia was far too eager to hear what Alice had to say. "Yes, Mama," I said, getting up from the table. "Comrade Alice, I would be happy to help you." I tried my best to keep the rage out of my voice. There was only one reason for Alice to be doing an inventory, and that was so she could report to Tupolev all that we owned. It would help him know what he could steal. I wished more than anything that we had a way out of this situation, but I feared we did not. Alice stood up, and I walked to the door. She followed, but she didn't look happy about going with me instead of my more congenial sister. "You speak English and Ukrainian?" I asked her as we walked out the door and around to the back. I was determined to sound friendly. "How come?" "I've spoken Ukrainian and English since I was little," she said. "I'm picking up Russian now, since everyone in the Communist Party seems to prefer it." "I know what you mean," I said. "We understand Russian. There's a lot of similarities with Ukrainian, but we prefer to speak our own language." "Me too," she said. "Russian feels funny on my tongue." "That's our storage shed," I said, pointing to the wooden structure with a sod roof beside the barn in progress. Between where we stood and the storage shed, there was a large mound of composting manure. As it rotted, it made good rich soil for our family vegetable garden, but it also had another purpose. It sat on top of a stone-lined storage cellar where we had hidden our precious store of millet, corn, and wheat seed, as well as emergency sacks of wheat for eating. The trap door to the cellar was undetectable unless you knew exactly where to look. We walked right past it as I led Alice to the storage shed. I opened the door for Alice, and she stepped inside. The shelves were lined with glass jars filled with preserves made from our own garden, pickled beets, cucumbers, and carrots. A brine barrel of cabbage heads sat in one corner, while hanging down from the ceiling were onions, garlic, and various herbs. There were also a couple of small burlap sacks of wild dried mushrooms and larger sacks of potatoes. "No flour or grain?" Alice asked. "The government requisitioned all of it last fall," I said. "In addition to our entire harvest, they took our stored wheat." "You do have some wheat," she said. "I noticed the hand mill and loaf pans in the kitchen area." "This is what we've been living on," I said, pointing to the items in the storage shed. "No grain at all?" she asked. "Just enough for our family to get by until the next harvest," I said. It was almost the truth. "Can you show me where it is?" she asked, holding up her inventory sheet. "I'd like to take note of it." "You probably already tallied it," I lied. "It was the sack in the kitchen pantry." "What's this?" she asked, stepping in front of our barn in progress. The outside structure was nearly finished, and I was still in the midst of putting up barn board partitions inside for individual stalls. Half of our barn was for animals, and the other half was to store sacks of grain. "Our barn burned down in the fall," I told her. "We're building a new one." "Where's your livestock?" she asked. "I'll need to inventory that as well." I took her across the road. "That is my aunt and uncle's house," I said, pointing at the big thatch roof cottage with a clay exterior tinted a cheerful yellow. "They're letting us use part of their barn for our animals until our new barn is finished." "What's their last name?" she asked, flipping through her papers. "Is it Chorney, like yours?" "Yes," I said. "Why?" "Papa and I are supposed to do the inventory on that farm later today." I led her around the back, and we stepped inside the barn together. Our animals and auntie and uncles were in separate sections, so I led Alice to our area. While I breathed in the familiar musky smell of our dear animals, Alice wrinkled her nose and a momentary look of disgust passed over her face. Manka, our cow, stood munching hay in the closest stall. She raised her head briefly to look at Alice, then me, with her liquid brown eyes. She seemed neither startled by nor interested in the stranger. She lowered her head and took another mouthful of hay. I stepped forward and gently laid my head on Manka's cheek. "What a good girl you are," I cooed under my breath as I caressed her flank. The cow pretended to ignore me, but I knew she liked this sort of attention. "Would you like to say hello to her?" I asked. Alice stood there, looking uncomfortable. She put her inventory list under her arm, then gave the cow a limp wave with her hand. "Hello, cow," she said. "Not like that." I guided her closer to Manka. "Put your face on her cheek." Alice stepped back. "I don't think so," she said. "That cow really smells." "This is what cows smell like," I said. "If you lived on a farm, you'd find it pleasant." "I don't live on a farm," said Alice, "and it's not pleasant." "Manka's with cough," I said. "She's pregnant?" she asked, her eyebrows raised. "She is," I said. "She'll give birth in April." Alice stepped in and peered at Manka's stomach, then quickly stepped back. Do you want to scratch her between the ears? I asked. She shook her head. I've got something else to show you. I guided her around the corner to the next stall. We came up to our new mother ewe, whose fluffy white head came nearly up to my shoulders. I squatted a bit so I was at eye level with her, then scratched her head between the ears. She leaned into me so I could scratch her head more thoroughly. "Oh," said Alice. "What a cute sheep. Does she have a name?" "This is Fluffy, and she's a ewe, not a sheep," I said. "I know, Fluffy is not a very original name. Would you like to scratch her head?" Alice smiled, then looked from my face to Fluffy's. "Will she bite me if I do that?" "Hold your hand out to her first," I said. "She'll want to smell you. Then squat so you're at eye level with her. She'll feel less intimidated if you're not towering over her." "Like this?" asked Alice, squatting low. "That's perfect," I said. "Now you can scratch her between the ears." Just then, Slavko rounded the corner, Fluffy's lamb, Bebe, cradled in his arms. "What an adorable baby!" Alice reached out to pat the lamb's head, but I grabbed her hand to stop her. Slavko's the only one who Fluffy trusts to look after Bebe. "Oh," said Alice. "I wouldn't have thought an animal would be so particular." "They're like humans, with their own personalities," I told her. "They're not tractors." She frowned at that, and I wish I could have taken back the comment. I didn't want her to think I was making fun of her, even if I was. We stepped back a little bit to give Slavko room. He set Bebe down underneath Fluffy, then held a finger to his lips to ensure we'd stay quiet. Bebe sniffed around a little bit, found one of its mother's udders, and began to nurse. "Let's give them some quiet," I whispered. I guided Alice out of the barn, and once we were well clear of it, I said, "Bebe only recently started to nurse. For the first few days, Slavko fed Bebe with a bottle and rag." "What a smart boy," said Alice. "How old is he?" 9, I said. "What an asset to the Kokots he'll be," she said. I stopped myself from saying something rude. I wanted her to like us so she wouldn't report us as a kulak family. Also, I was determined to show her what our life was really like, and why you couldn't just box it up and turn it into a factory. In the long run, I knew it wouldn't do any good. After all, it wasn't like she was in charge, but I still wanted her to understand why we loved our way of life. "Do you want to see our pasture area?" I asked. Alice seemed more relaxed now. "I would." We walked back across the road to the pasture behind the barn in progress. Yulia was now there, sitting on a tree stump doing homework. She'd let the chickens out, and they were squawking and pecking around her. Yulia looked up and sighed as we walked by, then went back to her work. "Look at this view," I said to Alice, pointing east. You could see all the way down to the wide river that bordered our village, and the fruit and willow trees that grew close to the water. Soon, those fruit trees will be covered with pink and white blossoms, and the willows will be silvery green. I noticed her studying our windmill atop a small hill overlooking the river. "With the heavy grain requisitions, that's not used much anymore," I said. "But before that, on days with a good wind, people from all over our village lined up to get their grain ground into flour." "Who owns the windmill?" asked Alice. "We do," I said. "I suppose you charged people when they used it?" said Alice. "We ground the flour for them," I said. "We kept it clean and in good repair. Why wouldn't we charge a fee?" "That's capitalist," said Alice. "Machinists like your father get paid. Bakers get paid. Why shouldn't we get paid to mill flour?" I asked. "The mill should be owned by the community so people can do it themselves." She added notes to her inventory list. "It doesn't matter anyway," I said. "The government took our grain. No one has anything to mill." She looked over to me and scowled. "You know that's not true." Her words made me squirm. I could have kicked myself for being so argumentative. I looked around to see what might distract her and noticed Silny, our chocolate-brown mare, grazing at the other end of the pasture. I whistled, and she trotted over. Alice looked up from her form and smiled. "What a beautiful horse," she said. "Can I pat her?" "She might nip you," I said. "Give her a minute to get used to you." I caressed the side of Silny's neck. "Are you having a good day, my darling?" Silny shook her mane at me and snorted. "It's been that kind of day, has it?" I asked her. I kept on caressing the side of her neck. Alice hesitantly held out her hand and said, "Hi, Silny. My name is Alice." Silny sniffed Alice's hand. "Stand beside me and pat her here," I said, guiding Alice over to where I stood. Alice reached up and caressed Silny's long neck, and Silny, to her credit, tolerated it. "Silny is better than a tractor," I said. "She doesn't run out of gas or break down. Not only that, we love her." "She is beautiful," said Alice. "If we joined the Kolchots, what would happen to Silny? What about the other horses?" I asked. The question seemed to startle Alice. "I never thought about that," she said. "But surely they'd find a use for them." "And who would care for Silny?" I asked. "She'd be common property. She'd lose the love we give her." Alice's eyebrows puckered, and I hoped she was thinking about what I said. Our farm and our family were more than just cogs in the machine for producing grain. I stood in silence while Alice filled out the rest of her inventory, and I shuddered at the thought of all that I loved being reduced to items on a list. Just then, there was a loud banging sound. Alice looked up. "You're supposed to go to the village square," she said. "More speeches?" I asked. "Always more speeches," she said. "But also something else."